Hey guys, how's it going? Jam here, and welcome to another track build battle. And I believe this is the first episode where we'll be doing a bit of a generation battle, or a different model battle type of thing. Basically, we've got two Chevrolet Novas up in this episode. The 66 model, which is on screen now, and the 1969 version, which we'll have after. Big thanks to my good friend Yami here, and I'll put his comment on the screen right now because he's the guy that suggested I do this video, and I was very happy to oblige because I do rather like both of these Chevrolet Novas. Now, starting out with this 66 model, as I said, as always, starting on paper first. 6.5 speed, as always, doesn't really mean anything, so while we're here, I'll tell you that this car does 153 miles an hour going into turn 1, and it does that pretty darn consistently. I've not quite hit 154, but 153 still makes this one of the fastest cars in a straight line going down towards turn 1 on a flying lap. Next up, handling 5.7. I think it's relatively average for this series. I think a lot of cars have between about 5.6 and 5.8. We have had cars that are a lot better handling, but 5.7, while lower on probably the average range of the series, is still a decent handling stat, and I was more than happy with how the car drove on track. It did have a little bit of understeer issues, especially around through some of the slower corners. Turn 2, the first of the very tight right-handers, it was typically okay at, but this turn 3, the next one, was I've spoken about it a bit before. It's an off-camber, very tight corner, and it was very tricky. Turn 1's quite tricky there as well, apparently, right on the edge of the grip in this car. This turn 1, as I was saying, is alright, but this is turn 3 now, going around there. So you're taking quite a lot of grass, and I was having quite a few issues at that corner. So yeah, 5.7 for handling. Going into the Lesmos as well, the first part was typically not too bad because you carry quite a lot of speed through it, but the second part, I keep doing this. I noticed this in the last video. I've called it the Lesmos. They're not the Lesmos, they're the Degnas. So yeah, Degna 2 was a little bit tricky, and this hairpin wasn't too bad. Coming out of the hairpin, it was actually remarkably good. Most cars struggle with a lot of wheel spin, but as you can see there, no tyre smoke. And it really got off the corner very well, and it got off all the corners very well, with 8.6 acceleration being, I think, one of the better acceleration stats we've had in this series. And it really felt it. It really launched off the corners very quickly. And so the final stat for the Forza stats is 5.8 braking. I've got not much to say about the braking. They didn't feel fantastic. They weren't terrible. They were all right. So I can't really expand on that. That's just the brakes. The other interesting thing to talk about in this car is, as you can see, it's the first car to have the engine sticking out the bonnet. It's the first car of the series where I've been able to do that, I believe, so I figured I'd go for it. I probably won't go for it again because there was some serious visibility issues, especially coming into the tight right-handers that I've already mentioned that it was struggling through. So yeah, that was a bit of annoying. Also, it didn't help that you sat quite low down in the car, so visibility wasn't great. Anyway, it's also a first because this is the first car not to be running its stock engine in its stock configuration. It is still running the stock engine, but it's got a supercharger added to it in order to make it up to the top of A-Class. I'm not convinced that it was 100% necessary. I might have just got to 700 PI if I'd maxed out every single little part, but it was struggling to get up there, so I decided to add a supercharger just to help it out. So that means that this car is now producing 537 brake horsepower with 520 pounds-foot of torque, or thereabouts, and it weighs in at 2,660 pounds, obviously with race weight reduction. And the tyres, it's running 255s on the front and 295s on the rear. 295s on the rear isn't phenomenally big by muscle car standards, but as I've already mentioned, the traction was fine. It was great out of the corners, so that was more than sufficient. I would have liked slightly bigger tyres though, because as I say, especially slow speed turning wasn't always fantastic, but that was the biggest that it's got. And as we come around to finish lap 3, that was almost perfect timing. So I'll finish it off there, and we'll move on to the newer model up next on track in just a second. So we do now indeed move on to the slightly newer version, the 1969 Chevy Nova. Now, this car was... I was expecting them to both be really rather similar, being the same car, or same car name, essentially, even though they're sort of different body types and different styles of the car. They're both Chevy Novas, and they're only 3 years apart, so I really was expecting them to be quite similar. However, there were some rather glaring differences. Some of them within the build that I put on the car, and some of them just within the options for the car itself. And sorry if you heard my chair squeak a minute ago. I normally start by talking about the Forza stats, but while I'm on a roll with these differences, I'll carry on there. The first difference in this car is the engine. Now, this is where I think the two cars are very similar. They both just about max out power-wise, or very nearly max out power-wise, just to get it to the top of A-Class. However, because of how marginal it was on the older car, I decided to put in a supercharger. However, in this car you get some slightly different options, for example bigger tyres, which I'll get into later, which enable the PI to just be a little bit higher in this later model, so I didn't need to go for a supercharger. So that meant that this car is now putting out 524 horsepower with 505 foot-pounds of torque. Now, while those stats are only marginally lower than the older model, the bigger difference is the fact that this doesn't have a supercharger. Now that in itself isn't necessarily that big of an issue, or big of a difference, but the fact that that means that this car does have race cams is quite a difference, because it means that this car has noticeably longer gears. Also, the weight in this car is it's a lot heavier. The race weight reduction just doesn't let you get down to as low a weight as the old Nova. It's about 200 pounds heavier, and that's with the older Nova getting an additional weight in through the addition of the supercharger. It might not be the biggest difference in the world, but you know, it's still added on. So this is weighing around 2,880 pounds compared to the 2,660 of the older model. I did briefly mention the tyres, and this car does have bigger tyres. It's got two 7.5s on the front, which I'd very much liked on the older Nova, so it should have slightly better turn-in, and I did notice that, especially through the slower corners that I mentioned earlier. And the rear tyres is where there's a huge difference, with this car having 3 4.5s on the rear compared to the older car's 2 9.5s. Now, I really didn't notice that in this car. You'd expect it to have much better traction and acceleration out of the, especially the slower corners, but I'm afraid I just didn't notice that on track. Maybe it's because it's heavier and lower power, so it didn't feel as rapid, but that would have also helped for the traction. It just didn't. I didn't really feel it. That's what I'm trying to say. So we've gone about it in a roundabout kind of way, but we ended up with the Forza stats. This car has very, very, very similar statistics. It shares the 6.5 speed stat, which is, as always, rather irrelevant. This car was actually slightly slower down the back straight. It could hit 153, as did the older model, but it wasn't as consistently there. On an average run, you're only going to hit 152. So it's probably talking decimals of a mile an hour slower on average, but it was ever so slightly slower. You probably wouldn't notice it in race, but I did notice it because I do like to check. It's got the same 5.7 handling. I don't really have much to report on the handling of either of these cars. They were both quite nice to drive. As I say, there's a little bit of understeer through slower speed corners. This car was slightly better at higher speed, especially through the fast right we've just gone through, leading into that tight hairpin. It was a little bit better through that section. 8.7 acceleration for this car compared to the other car's 8.6, but if anything it felt the other way around. As I've already mentioned, it didn't feel as spectacular out of the corners. I suppose that might be due to the gearing. Once you got past the initial sort of lurch and through the low revs, you really did feel it pick up. But I think the older Nova with the shorter gears, had a little bit of an advantage there. And the final stat is 5.9 braking, which is supposed to be slightly better than the 5.8 of the older model, but once again, I didn't really feel a difference, and I've just about squeezed it in about 3 laps worth of talking. So I'll wrap it up there, and we'll go and look at the head-to-head comparisons and see which car was quicker. So here we are now starting the fastest laps in both of these cars. as you'd expect at this moment in time, there's nothing to really tell between them, although perhaps that extra little top speed in the older Nova looks like it might be flicking between cuts a little bit quicker. Although going into the braking zone, maybe still a little bit ahead. Both very tidy around turn 1. The newer car a little bit tighter to the apex. The older car perhaps with a slightly wider, better run though. On the exit of the corner, you'd expect them again to be pretty even. Just looking at the jumps between the cuts, and it does look like the older car is just ahead, using more curb on the way through the first Degner. Both of them are going to use a lot of exit curb on the second Degner. Most cars do that. Going into the tight hairpin now, this is where I felt that the newer car was certainly better. Looks like they are pretty close coming out of the corner now. And I think it is the older car that is pulling ahead. How they're going to manage the alternate chicane, a very tricky chicane. You've got to be very on it and very tidy. And it does look as though the older car is still just ahead. That that lap in that older car through that middle sector was phenomenal. I couldn't touch it. I said it rather early on as well. So it was definitely very quick through there. And it's still definitely ahead going into Spoon for the final corner. But running wide through the first part of the corner is the old car. The new car keeping it much tidier, very neck and neck looking on the exit there. It's going to be a sprint to the line. Which one is going to get there first? We know the older car looks a little bit better in a straight line, and I think it won by about a car length. It was a very, very close finish. So on to the times. The 66 Nova was phenomenally fast. 26.196. It's gone fastest by half a second. Yeah, that's quick. So let's see where the newer car goes. We know it was a little bit slower, perhaps, but how much slower is it going to be? About 0.2. So we've now got a Nova 1-2 on the leaderboards. Yeah, those things are quick. And they were pretty nice to drive as well. So I think I may be doing some more muscle cars in the future. That seems to be the way to go. Anyway, that is it for this episode of the Track Build Battles. If there's any other battles you want to see, let me know down in the comments. And until then, I'll see you for the next one. Goodbye.